So, as you know, we've been going through the Gospel of John, and we're still in chapter 1, and that's okay. So far, we've been focusing on one person, because that's what the Apostle John does. He talks about the Word and the light, and then he reveals who the Word and the light is, and that is the Lord Jesus. He's saying that the Word was God, that he became flesh and dwelt among us. He says that this Word is the true light of the world, and that whoever receives this Word, whoever receives this light, has the right to be called a child of God. But now here in verse 19 to 34, John changes who he's talking about. In the first few verses, he's talking about the Lord Jesus. Now he switches and is now talking about John the Baptist. And he introduced him actually before in verse 6, where he says there was a man sent from God whose name was John. Now, this is not John the Apostle who wrote this book, but rather it's John the Baptist. So let's get into this passage. So the story starts off like this. These Jews come up to John the Baptist, and they're like, "Who are you?" That's a fair question, right? And John the Baptist goes, "I am not the Christ." And these Jews are like, "Okay, are you Elijah?" John says, "No." "Okay, are you the prophet?" Again, John says, "No." And the Jews are like, "Okay, you're not the Christ, you're not the prophet, you're not Elijah, so who are you? What do you have to say about yourself?" And John the Baptist says, "I am the voice of one crying in the wilderness, 'Make straight the way of the Lord.'" Now, I don't know about you, but if I asked someone who they were, and they answered me something like what John the Baptist answered the Jews, I'd think he might be a little crazy, you know? But anyways, the Jews carry on and they're saying, "Okay, you're not the Christ, you're not Elijah, you're not the prophet. Why then are you baptizing?" And I love what John the Baptist answers. He says, "I baptize in water, but there's one coming after me whom you don't know. And it is this person whose sandals I am not even worthy to untie." So that's just an overview of this passage here. Let's go back and get into the text. What's so significant about these Jews asking John the Baptist if he's the Christ, if he's Elijah, or if he's the prophet? Well, first of all, the Jews knew the prophecies. They knew that the Christ was expected to come around that time frame. The book of Daniel records this. It gives a timeline about when the Christ should come. And so Jews who knew the scriptures were aware that sometime soon the Christ should be coming. And so they're on the lookout for him. And when they see John the Baptist coming, he's preaching, he's baptizing, maybe they're thinking, "Oh, maybe this is our Christ, maybe he's the Messiah." But John the Baptist says, "No, I'm not the Christ." And then the Jews say, "Okay, are you Elijah?" Now, why would they ask if he's Elijah? Look in Malachi chapter 4 and verse 5. It reads, "Behold, I am going to send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Lord." So again, you have the Jews who are familiar with the Old Testament, at least the book of Malachi in this case, and they see that Elijah is going to come before a judgment day of God. And they're wondering, okay, maybe this is Elijah. Elijah used to preach about how we're doing wrong, and this man who's here is doing the same thing. Could this be the prophesied Elijah? But John the Baptist says, "No, I'm not Elijah." And the Jews say, "Okay, what about the prophet?" Look at Deuteronomy chapter 18 and verse 15. It reads, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you. From your countrymen you shall listen to him." And then down in verse 18, "I will raise up a prophet from among their countrymen like you, and I will put my words in his mouth, and he shall speak to them all that I command him." And so again, you have these Jews who know that prophecy. They know that a prophet is coming who was foretold back then. And they're wondering, is this man the prophet. And actually later on in the book of Acts, we find out the identity of this prophet. In Peter's sermon, he quotes Deuteronomy 18 verse 15, and he identifies it as the Lord Jesus. We see this in Acts chapter 3 and verse 22. So then the Jews get tired of asking this man who he is, and they're like, okay, you're not these people. Who are you? What do you have to say about yourself? And that's when John quotes this verse from Isaiah. I am a voice crying in the wilderness, make straight the way of the Lord. What does that even mean? Well, let's go back to Isaiah. Isaiah chapter 40 and verse 3 is where John the Baptist quotes this from. Looking down in the context, it's clear that this person who is supposed to make straight the way of the Lord was sent as a preview of the Lord, or of the Lord's glory, especially, and we see that in verse 5. And so when John the Baptist says this, he's revealing his purpose and why he's there. But the Jews don't get it yet. They're like, why can't you just give us a straight answer? Why are you baptizing? If you're not the Christ, you're not Elijah, and you're not the prophet, who do you think you are to be baptizing like this? And I love John's answer. Instead of being like, I just told you guys, why can't you listen? Instead, he shifts the focus from himself and points it to someone else. He says, I baptize in water, but there's someone coming after me whom you don't know. And in verse 27, it reads, it is he who comes after me, the thong of whose sandal I am not worthy to untie. So I hope you see what he's doing. He's shifting the focus from himself and pointing it to the Lord Jesus, because that was his purpose. His purpose was to make straight the way of the Lord. He was a preview of the Lord Jesus Christ and of his glory that was coming. He says, don't look at me. I'm nobody. Look at the one who's coming after me. He's so much more important than I am. And we can draw a couple lessons from this. When people ask us who we are, what's our answer? Who do we say that we are? If someone comes up to you and says, who are you? Maybe you might say, oh, my name is Josh, and I'm a really great guy, and I can do all these things. No, that's not what you're supposed to do. Follow John the Baptist's example. Point people towards the Lord Jesus. It might look something like this. Someone could come up to you and say, who are you? You might say, well, my name is Josh and I'm a Christian. I believe that the Lord Jesus came down to this earth and he died for you and for me to take away my sin and your sin, and that he rose from the dead as well. It might seem like a strange answer to people, and I'm sure it might seem strange to you as well. But I hope you get the point that I'm trying to make. You don't have to say those exact words, but when you're meeting with people, even in just a daily interaction, point them to Jesus. Because without him, we are nothing. I am nothing, and you are nothing. Because Jesus truly is the author and perfecter of our faith. He is the one who can make people whole. And ultimately, the person who you're talking to, whether they're a believer or a non-believer, they still need Jesus. If they're a believer, they still need him to rely on him throughout their day. And if they're a non-believer, they need him to save them. They need to be saved. So just as an encouragement, wherever you are, don't brag about yourself. Brag about the Lord Jesus.